And I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. It's going to be a real treat. Orlando-based writer and graphic designer Rick Kilby is the author of Florida's Healing Waters, Gilded Age, Mineral Springs, Seaside Resorts, and Health Spas, University of Florida Press, published in 2020. It received the silver medal for the Florida nonfiction from the Florida Book Awards and the Florida Historical Society Stetson Kennedy Award. His first book, Finding the Fountain of Youth, Ponce de Leon and Florida's Magical Waters, again UPF 2013, won a Florida Book Award in the Visual Arts category. In the decades since his first book was published, Kilby has given presentations at museums, libraries, conferences, and even on a boat. His old Florida blog has received over 1 million views, and he currently collaborates with fellow UPF author Kathy Salustri on the Florida Spectacular podcast. Rick's presentation tonight is called Connections to Place, Exploring the Florida Waters of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. Since we're not having a contest, can anybody else besides David Nolan tell me who the man in the boat is? It is not Uncle Norton. He denies it categorically. Well, he did anyway. Not Uncle Norton. Cecil Clark, the hardware store owner in Ocala. Everybody gets an F, except for David Nolan. Anyway, please welcome Rick Kilby, who's going to be regaling us today.
Thank you all. It's an honor to be here. When Flo first asked me to do this talk, I wasn't sure she had the right person. I'm not a Rawlings scholar, but I do know a lot about Rick Kilby, and so I want to talk about me for a while. I call this picture a portrait of a moonshiner. This is my grandfather, who was a moonshiner in North Georgia. My dad never told me. That was a deep, dark family secret. He had several brushes with the law. And I'm not sure exactly whether he went to jail, or there's a story that he also worked on the Fontana Dam or not. But my dad used to tell stories of very much, he had a lifestyle like someone in Cross Creek. He had to fetch the water from the spring. He had to shoot squirrels to eat. He had a lot of fishing stories. That's my dad. So my dad went from overalls to plaid in one generation. He was a city planner for the city of Gainesville. Did very well for himself, but my connection here with Rawlings is that we kind of wanted to fulfill our father's dream. You know, Marjorie's father, at least according to Ann McCutcheon, really had this urge to farm and to go back on the farm, and that kind of was fulfilled by Marjorie buying Cross Creek. My dad wanted to connect with the land. He wanted to have that more rustic lifestyle that he grew up with. And so, while most of the cool kids in Gainesville were having condos at Crescent Beach, we had a condo in Willaca, Florida. I would learn later that our condo was on Beecher Point, named for Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother. I would learn later I'm related to Harriet Beecher Stowe. I would learn later that William Bartram originally named it Mount Hope, and that the other Marjorie Harris Carr, when she first got out of school, worked in Willaca. There's a ton of history there. I know there was a great indigenous history because when the tide was out and water was low enough in the river, we found tons of pottery shards. Back then you could pick them up. Somewhere in my mom's house, there's several shoeboxes full of Timucua Indian pottery. But I think that similarity, this is where I learned to love Old Florida. It's part of my blood. This is where I felt this, what Ann McCutcheon calls the cosmic connection to the wild Florida. So these are the watery places that I want to talk about today. There's Willaca right there on the St. Johns River, right across from the mouth of the Ocklawaha. The Ocklawaha goes, and then Orange Creek comes off and goes to Orange Lake, and of course Frost Creek goes between Orange Lake and Lake Lockaloosa. Orange Springs is there. The Ocklawaha, as you know, comes down. The major tributary of the Ocklawaha is the Silver River. The Ocklawaha starts at Lake Griffin. Of course, you can go through all these canals and come to the Lakeside Inn. On the other side of the state, I live a couple blocks from Highway 50, and Highway 50 in the St. Johns River is where Marjorie started her cruise. Down or up?
Down.
Down the river all the way to the Ocklawaha. So these are the watery places that meant a lot to Marjorie and mean a lot to me. And I love this quote at the beginning of the yearling. I feel like this kind of shows the connectedness. That, you know, it's a great metaphor that we are all drops of water in a big ocean, and that the water begins in this small spring and eventually makes its way to the sea. But I want to talk first, before I talk about watery places, I want to talk about the brand of Florida. I am a graphic designer. I do a lot of marketing, a lot of branding. And my personal journey to kind of rediscover old Florida for myself began because of this kitschy photograph of these wax figures at the Fountain of Youth attraction in St. Augustine. Who's been to the Fountain of Youth attraction in St. Augustine? So my cheapskate dad said, you do not go to tourist traps. They just want to take your money. And that was embedded in my brain for years until I was an adult and had my own money and could go to cheap tourist traps like this. And I loved the place because what I found was there's real history there. You know, this is where Pedro Menendez had his first camp in the village of Soloy. And had they sold out, it could be condos, but now they do archaeological. Kathy Deegan does archaeological digs every single summer there. It's one of the most important archaeological places in Florida. So that inspired me. I wanted to find out more places in Florida that their stories I didn't know about. And so I started this Old Florida page. It blew up. At one point it had over 100,000 people. Then Facebook changed their algorithm. Now it's got about half that. I started blogging, and that's when I started writing because I kept discovering these stories that I felt needed to be told. And then I looked back at my first blog, and I said, living here has changed the way I view the world. I noticed subtlety in nature that I overlooked before merely by being still. And I'm always surprised, and I'm like, wow, who is that guy? He sounds really deep. One of the things that I'm a bit obsessive. One of the things I got obsessed about was finding these, what I call Poncebilia images throughout the state. I call Ponce de Leon the first Florida man. He was like this unpaid celebrity endorser for the state of Florida, and you could find his image everywhere until about the middle of the 20th century. So there's still vestiges out there, but then we started to learn maybe colonialism wasn't a good thing, maybe conquistadors weren't the nicest guys, so maybe we shouldn't put him on everything. But so I tried to find it wherever I could, and this is where I started to become interested in the brand of Florida and how it was promoted. And so Ponce was everywhere. Now this to me is like quintessential Florida advertising. This is, and I still can't figure out what Ponce's idea is here, to take his picnic to the beach. I don't know. So this quote from Marjorie is from Flo's 2012 article in the Florida Historical Quarterly, and it says, the future of Florida is perhaps a trifle too rosy from the point of view of the quiet citizen and the nature lover. The climate is too inductive to many forms of industry, the charms of summer and winter too attractive. It remains to be seen whether the Florida of Bartram will survive or whether the Chamber of Commerce will kill the goose that lays the golden egg. We still have that tension today. So one of the themes that I want to explore is that the places seem eternal in Rawlings' writing, but many of these water places right now, this very instant in time, are at a crossroad. And this is the crossroad we're talking about, whether they will kill the goose that lays the golden egg or not. So not only Florida used this whole Fountain of Youth idea, this is one for my home county of Orange County, where you could stay younger longer if you sit on your back porch and throw out a line and catch a giant bass. And another thing I want to point out, I love this type, garden wonderland of 1,000 lakes, orange groves, and tropical palms. Fish in your own backyard, because this is quintessential Florida advertising, but early on they started with very agricultural themes. And the person I think that started with is none other than my relative. Did I tell you I'm related to Harriet Beecher Stowe? Florida's first influencer, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She came down here and wintered in Mandarin right on the banks of the St. Johns River. She wrote 30 articles about how great it was She was popular. Two things to illustrate the popularity. Only the Bible sold more copies than Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 19th century. And when she met Lincoln, Lincoln said, "You're the little lady who started the Great War." That's how popular. She was like Oprah. She was awesome. So she comes to Florida. She winters here. She thinks, and Mandarin still found a place to write in peace. But you know what happened? The same thing that happened to Marjorie. People would come up and want to meet her. They would stop at the pier at the end of her property, and they'd go and they'd bug her, and she never got to write in peace at all. Same thing had happened to Marjorie. But she had so much cachet that when she wrote about Florida, people listened. But she also had a different reason for writing. She had orange groves just like Rawlings did, but she wrote, this is a great quote, "Many Northerners, Stowe included, believed an orange industry would inspire a cultural awakening in Florida and foster a more egalitarian atmosphere that would supplant industry tarnished by slave systems." She and a group of other former abolitionists came into Northeast Florida, and they had a motive. They wanted to try and change the system of government in Florida to make opportunities for the freedmen in Florida. So people like Stowe and Chloe Merrick Reed came in here, and they tried to have kind of a Republican takeover, Republican values of the 19th century, not today, and change the system. Because after the Civil War, the economy in Florida was just broken. Didn't work anymore because there was this labor shortage. So the Department of Immigration started the Department of Agriculture started this Commission of Immigration. Seth French was the first commissioner of immigration. Seth French was a pioneer in the city of Orange City in Volusia County and in Sanford as well, so he lived in Central Florida, in Volusia and Seminole County, and he put out publications like this, Florida and its Climate, Soil, and Productions, and in this, Florida as it is. And I love the iconography because we're going to trace this iconography and how it appealed to people for agriculture, and not the sun and fun as you saw in the ad with Ponce de Leon, a cornucopia in this beautiful river scene that could be Cross Creek or the Ocklawaha or the St. John's in certain parts. But for some reason, the icon of the cornucopia appeared again and again and again in Florida advertising. I think this is from the Smathers Library. Sorry, I don't have it properly credited. I don't know what year this came out, but it's my favorite image. I used it in my first book because it kind of combines Venus on the half shell with the Fountain of Youth. And so she's this beautiful Greek goddess, and the cornucopia is exactly the shape of Florida, and there's flowers coming out. And you keep, again, the same iconography. I see her kind of as Persephone, who is the goddess of the harvest, as well as the goddess of flowers, and one of the symbols associated with her is the deer. So this is a late 19th century one, and you can see all the fruits and vegetables spilling out of the cornucopia, and this is from probably the 1920s. Again, the Bureau of Immigration through the Department of Agriculture. This one cracks me up because if you read this, it's like, this is how you can be a better, perfect wife on a farm. And it's like, does this look like any rural building you've ever seen? I mean, this is, if Rawlings saw this, because this came out in 1927, if this is what she hoped for in Cross Creek, she would have been very disappointed. To me, it looks like the illustrator here never actually saw Florida. They just sprinkled in some palm trees and some Spanish moss. But I love the artwork. So, again, more of this branding of Florida. This came out in 1883. This is a book called Eden of the South, description of the orange groves, vegetable farms, strawberry fields, peach orchards, soil, climate, natural peculiarities, and the people of Alachua County, Florida, together with other valuable information for tourists and invalids. Quite a mouthful. But tourists and invalids are last because we see Florida branding today, usually the tourists are first, but back then it was agriculture, and this is about 10 years before the Great Freeze knocked all the citrus out of North Florida and much of the Florida. So here's a piece. It's a postcard book that was mailed in 1835. I'm sorry, 1935. Sorry. 1935. But again, it's very orderly, very neat. You can have this, health and wealth. Two big themes in Florida promotion. And look at the border, this flower border, because it's almost the same pattern that's on Marjorie's apron here, exactly. I don't know if you're familiar with this image of Marjorie from Jackson Walker. It's, I believe, in the Volusia County Courthouse. I stop often to look at his paintings there. I love them. But to me, this is like an updated version of Persephone. Instead of holding a cornucopia, she's holding a basket of orange fritters. So we know that in 28, Marjorie moved there, moved to Cross Creek. She fell in love with it. Perhaps she had seen some of that branding, some of that advertising with State. And she found home there. And I think the feeling she describes here, that mystic loveliness of childhood, that sense of nostalgia, is how I feel about Old Florida. And I think that's one of the first ways that I can connect her to my work, is that I moved here in 1966 as an infant. And my wife and I, when politics gets a little crazy in the state, think about where else we could live. And we can't find a place we want to live more because we love Florida so much. But the truth of the matter, I think, is in this book. This is by Isa Doofus Hardy, came out in 1886. Orange and alligators, two extremes. One way is the health and wealth, and the other is not so good. Florida is the best lied state about in the Union. Florida has been much misrepresented for good and ill as earthly paradise, smiling in eternal sunshine, in which storms and frosts are unknowns, on whose fair and fruitful groves the blighting breath of winter never falls. Strike the balance between the views of these two parties, and you'll come somewhere near the truth about this state, which has good and bad qualities mixed and blended. I think that's the truth. We know Rawlings had to deal with freezes and almost went broke and all sorts of troubles on her groves, despite the fact it was her spiritual home. So there's also this, I think I talked about it before, this eternal feeling. And this is a painting I discovered at the Appleton in Ocala recently. It's Christopher Still is another one of my favorite Florida artists. An early painting he did of the Ocklawaha, because it has this timeless sense to it. It's beautiful and wonderful. And if you go to the Appleton, make sure you see Margaret Tolbert's wonderful spring paintings. So Marjorie got to Florida about 10 years after the end of the steamboat era. In 1919 is when Hubbard Hart stopped running steamboat lines up the Ocklawaha. But the commerce was still important going up the St. John's and the Ocklawaha. And I think she probably witnessed vestiges of the industry, so when she wrote about it, she could write about it from a place of knowledge. But this is one of my favorite periods in Florida history, when there were literally hundreds of steamboats going up and down the St. Johns River. I love this quote. So originally, Jacksonville was called Cowford. It was the place you could ford the river with your cows because it was so shallow. In 1840, 350 residents. But by the end of that century, 60 years later, they were getting 70,000 visitors annually. So you see that in this image. You see sailing vessels, you see steamboats, you see railroads crossing the bridge. Its proximity to the ocean made it the entry point for people coming to the state in the 19th century. They would generally get on a steamer in New York, come down to Charleston, to Savannah, and then to Jacksonville. And that's where they would jump on steamboats. And the reason, I think, one of the reasons why that was so popular was because it was really glorified by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Did I tell you I'm related to her? So it's not quite that, a little more distant. So I love the way she writes about Florida. It reminds me of Rawlings. The language is a little bit more dated. Palmetto, hammocks, live oak groves, cypress, pine, bay, and magnolia form an interchanging picture. This is describing a trip up the St. John's. Vines hang festooned from tree to tree. Wildflowers tempt the eye on the near banks, and one is constantly longing for the boat to lay here or there. But it goes on a steady course, the pictured scene around constantly changing. So I thought, this is great. It's kind of old-fashioned. The cow is fording the river. And a couple weeks ago, I decided I would bring my kayak to Cross Creek and Orange Lake. And so I guess cattle in our water is something that still goes. And I actually did an airboat ride on the middle part of the St. John's near Christmas, and the same thing happened. There's cattle all over the water. So it still goes on today. So Cross Creek was right behind us when I took this photo. So Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote about the Grand Tour upriver. What's significant is, the Grand Tour that people in England would take when they would go back to the continent and kind of rediscover the classical tradition, and they would buy paintings and bathe in the spas. Well, she equates the trip upriver, up to St. John's, to the Grand Tour. So when you came to Florida in the 19th century, this is what you had to do. And one of the things the Victorian tourists liked to gawk at was shell middens. You know, the fact that Europeans weren't the first people here, and they called them aborigines. And unfortunately, a lot of these giant shell mounds and middens, this is one that was an enterprise that was very well known, has been demolished because they used it for road fill. But you know, there are still places where you can go and find these shell middens, but they were all up and down the St. John's at one point. So my book is about the healing waters, and this is kind of an exaggerated map showing the ones along the St. John's, and I just want to talk about a few of them. If you were coming out of Jacksonville, the first one you would see is Magnolia Springs, and it was the first big grand hotel probably built for taking the waters in Florida. I love the stories about the place, and that's one of the things that attracted me most was the story. So the guy, I believe his name, if I remember correctly, was Nathan Benedict. He was a surgeon in the Union Army, and he had run a water cure up in the north, and a water cure is a hydrotherapy facility. So it's natural he was attracted to a spring. There was this much smaller hotel at the same time. And the hotel was owned by a guy named Finnegan, who was a general in the Confederate Army, and he established an orphanage for the freedmen in the very same hotel, and I love that. And eventually that would be knocked down and replaced by this grander hotel. The steamboats would come up and you would get off the boat, you'd be serenaded by a band, they would take you by in carriage to the hotel. Eventually the trains would get there and they would pick you up with a tram with a mule pulling it. But this is the spring. I think why I got interested in this topic to begin with was I'm very fascinated by the built environment at Florida Springs, at these wonderful natural places where we have kept tweaking them and changing them. And you know, originally they were probably most of these places were modified by the indigenous people there. This started out as a small spring. There wasn't enough water, so they kept drilling wells. So it's hard to know how much of a spring there was. When I visited there, somebody took my wife and I to see what was the spring, and it's just a small trickle. But if you look at the maps, you can see where they actually drilled wells on the site, because it's all from the aquifer anyways. So here's where Magnolia Spring was. This is the St. John's here. I think this is called Black Creek. And this walkway down here is called St. David's Path, and that's where you would promenade. And this is Green Cove Springs, which is called the Saratoga of the South, probably the biggest watering place in the state of Florida. Anybody, this is where you stop. So you start in Jacksonville, you had to stop at Green Cove Springs. It wasn't just about taking the waters, which is bathing and drinking the waters. It was about the whole societal pressures for people in the upper class. You went to these watering places.
That's Governor's Creek.
Governor's Creek, thank you. Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. This is a George Barker photo, one of my favorites. These two lovely ladies in the foreground. This is the spring here. It's a 3rd magnitude spring. It still reeks of sulfur to this day. This is the Clarington House, owned by a guy named Dr. Applegate, who was also a doctor in the Union Army, who built this beautiful resort in the early 1870s. And he would go up north and take the bottled water with him and give lectures about the efficacy of the water in order to bring more people down. This is Orange Spring, and all that was to lead up to Orange Spring, which is the spring that hopefully, I'd like to think Marjorie went there. It's very close to where she lived. Has anybody been to Orange Spring? Yay! Yay! So did you go before it was a bottling plant then?
Way before.
So you swam in it?
No, but I've been there, for 60 years off and on.
Oh. So it's a fascinating place because it really flourished during the age of the stagecoach, before there was a lot of steamboats going up and down the Ocklawaha River. And then I don't think the steamboats made that turn in Orange Creek. And so it really just became more of a local swimming hole than a medicinal spa. So this is a picture from Christmas Day 1911. And this is the picture. I bought this picture on eBay and I ended up using it for the cover of my book. I cropped in on it. There's so much good stuff going on. This is a safety line for people who can't swim. That's a common thing you saw in springs in those days. This looks like a big old piece of cypress they use as a diving board, which shows this is no longer a spa. This is a place where people are going for recreation. There's a guy on an ox right here. This dude's holding a pistol up in the air. And this guy's got a camera. The other thing to note is men and women didn't bathe together for the most part during that time. It was the Victorian era. Everyone was kind of prudish, so no mixing of the genders in swimming. For some reason, so here's what it looks like. I was there about 10 years ago. Here's what it looked like. For some reason, the story that Marjorie wrote about this minister who was looking for human connection when I saw this picture, it reminded me of that. That it's kind of a sad story because, he's swimming with this other guy and he thinks he's made a friend, and at the end, he finds out the whole time the guy knew he was a minister. Because it was kind of at a public swimming hole. It was a spring, and I thought, well, this would be perfect for that. So many of the places I want to talk about are at this crossroads right now. So Orange Spring is for sale. Has anybody got $10 million? We could buy it. And it comes with 67 acres as well as a consumptive use permits for 200,000 gallons a day. And there's a water bottling plant there. And when I was there was a water bottler there, but he was very into being a good steward. He bottled the amount in a year that he could have bottled in a day, according to the consumptive use permit. So he tried to be a good steward. I don't know. It's been closed for a while. It's for sale. Of course, Orange Springs goes to Orange Creek, which goes into the Ocklawaha River. And this picture is right at the top of the stairs. If you're sitting on the second floor, you can examine it closely. It's really fun to see all the details in a beautiful print. Again, Ocklawaha was like Green Cove Springs. One of the things you had to do if you made the grand trip up the river, and this depiction by a fellow UPF author, Rebecca McIntyre, describes it best. For the well-to-do northerners, the boggy, overgrown southern wetlands offered the perfect dark adventure. For these Victorians, taking a boat ride down a swampy southern river was a thrilling escape into the unknown, a peep show of the grotesque, blending the realistic and fantastic, which thrilled in a strange and disturbing way. It was the dark side of the picturesque. So you would start in Palatka, and it would be an overnight journey. And the payoff, of course, was Silver Springs. Hubbard Hart was a guy who proclaimed that he was a colonel. He had the rights to a stagecoach line that would go on an old military trail from Palatka to Tampa. And of course, he would go right through Orange Spring and Orange Lake and Ocala. So that's the big era of Orange Springs. But he also started clearing the river of obstructions so steamboats could go up. So he was the big pioneer, and he got a contract to clear the river after the Civil War and really kind of built an empire, and it kind of established that business. So here's a couple maps. This one, the river just looks pretty straight, like a straight line, but then you can see the serpentine when you look close up, just how twisted. Has everybody been on the Ocklawaha? This is such a knowledgeable crowd. Yeah, so you know what it's like. My dad used to go full throttle with his bass boat, and one time the steering cable broke and we went careening into the bank, and I laughed my head off because I was of the age when it was fun to see your dad do something like that. Poor dad. It's fascinating to me there were all these stops along the way because they look like they're very close together, but I think Marjorie talks about in several of her books how important the steamboats were for commerce. That's how you got your goods to market. That's how you got your goods to your home if they were from someplace else. So this is a typical steamboat stop, landing, I should say. A couple things that interest me in this photo. One is just how primitive it is. Very little built environment at all. All the wood, because these were wood-burning vessels, so you were constantly having to refill fuel, and all the barrels. So because that's how you would get your oranges to market. This was before they had citrus crates. So we know all the old growth timber was logged out. Marjorie writes about that in South Moon Under. Here's a view of the raft, and she does a great job of describing the raft. And if you're a tree hugger, this will trigger you because I hate to see it. Look at the size of that tree that they bring and they're going to cut down. The Wilson Brothers, I believe, was at one point the first or second largest cypress mill in the entire world. And they were there until 1944 when there was no more wood left to cut down. But there you can still find things that somehow didn't make it. The trees that had blemishes didn't get cut down a lot of times. So on the left, this is Images of America illustration, which was a really important book in promoting Florida. On the right, this is during the drawdown, and I'll talk a little bit more about the drawdown. And A friend of mine, a friend of Leslie's too, Captain Karen, actually had a tea party inside of the big cypress tree. So you would start at Palatka, and you would go through the night, and Sidney Lanier writes this brilliant passage about the fire advances up these dark sinuosities like a brilliant god that for his mere whimsical pleasure calls the black impenetrable chaos ahead into instantaneous definite forms as he floats along the river's curves. So they would light all this fat pine up there, and I want to figure out a way to recreate this and photograph it, but I keep thinking a fire and an outboard engine with gas tanks is not a good mix, and I shouldn't try it. So the big payoff, once you went up the river, of course, is Silver Springs. This is the same boat I showed before. These boats were custom made with the paddle wheel in the back, not on the sides, because if you look at the picture upstairs, you notice the boat is actually touching the bank. It was that narrow and twisty. And again, there's barrels here. I've heard apocryphal stories that I haven't decided if they were true, that you could actually fish in your hotel room right from your room. There was just a trap door.
You can do that in Astor.
An Astor? Oh, we'll have to talk later. So Silver Springs, in terms of the Belton environment, is one of the places that's most fascinating to me because, just the different generations. So this is early Victorian era. You see the steamboat dock, and you see trains here. This is what it looked like when I was a kid. Growing up in Gainesville, whenever somebody came to town, this is where you took them. They were before Disney. And, the glass bottom boats. This is the Prince of Peace Memorial. There was a car museum over here. And the underwater observatory. This is one of my favorite pictures my dad ever took. This is my mom and my grandmother in the underwater observatory.
Oh, that's great.
I love this photo.
Granny glass.
But this is what the water looked like. This is a Bruce Mozart photograph, and you can see, healthy. It's sugar sand and healthy eelgrass. This is the kind of promotion that they did in the mid 19th century. So when I started writing my first book, I kind of got involved with people who were documenting and talking about springs a lot. I'd heard that Silver Springs was in bad shape. So I bought a little underwater point chute, rented a canoe, went upriver, and at first they said, all by yourself, it's going to be really hard to paddle, and it wasn't the case because there was hardly any flow at all coming out of the spring. And there's just, it doesn't look anything like this. You see the difference. It's covered with goo. And that kind of turned me into an environmentalist. That was kind of the moment in time where that flip was switched. There was a car parts billionaire out of Canada named Frank Stronach who wanted to get a consumptive use permit to pump more water out for a beef farm than the city of Ocala was currently pumping. So I did my first protest outside of a IFAS facility in Citra, and I did this Photoshop image which has appeared in books, and they made postcards and sent them to the state legislature. So he eventually backed off his request for his consumptive use permit, but I think it's likely he's probably not paying attention to that. Of course, is everybody familiar with the Cross Florida Barge Canal? Yes. So we know it's the horrible thing, the crusher, and this is a picture I took of just how gunky the lake gets. The biggest thing we could do in terms of springs restoration is to free the Ocklawaha River, because there are 20 springs that are covered up with 11 feet of water that would come back to life if we simply removed the dam. So thank you. So they used to do it every 3 or 4 years. It's been a long time since they did the last drawdown. This is Kinnan Springs. My friend Captain Karen took me there. Again, this is inside Captain Springs. This is one from below the dam. That muscly guy in there, that's me. So the Fountain of Youth was how I got interested in springs. And what I always say is that every spring in Florida, if it's marketed commercially at one time or another, claims to be the Fountain of Youth. In terms of advertising, it's low-hanging fruit, and everyone did, including Salt Springs. And Salt Springs, again, is really in Rawlings country. It was owned by the Ray family, the same family that developed Silver Springs. They built the campground there. And in this article, there are all these apocryphal stories of people who were healed there. It has They found this little pocket of water that has a high degree of salt in it, or a high amount of salt, I should say. It's mostly saline. Of course, Bartram landed there. Here's another wonderful Jackson Walker painting called The Flower Hunter. I love this passage. The basin ornamented with great variety of fruitful and floriferous trees, shrubs, and plants, the pendant gold orange dancing on the surface of the pellucid waters. Perhaps the first description of a Florida spring in English, maybe. And here's a photo of what the spring looks like. It has this stupid wall. Again, another example of the built environment, and not a good job with the built environment. Here's what it looked like during Rawlings' time in 1941. A couple of things I want to point out. This appears to be a shell midden right here, because a lot of springs have indigenous people who live there along them, and the healthy eelgrass. I went there in December on a very cold day on my way up to Gainesville for Christmas. In the spring itself, there was nothing growing. There was no submerged aquatic growth whatsoever. But on a cloudy day, it was spectacularly beautiful. So again, we're at a crossroads. The vendor who runs it for the Forestry Service is changing vendors, perhaps. The contract runs out this year. So they're thinking that they might take that opportunity to try and restore the spring. So on social media, there is a lot of feelings, I should say, on both sides of that, because people have this connection to place on both sides. The people who want to restore the spring, and the people who love it and think it's theirs to take care of. So on the Howard T. Dome Springs Institute, there are things you can do to restore a spring. And a lot of it is less motorboat traffic, and less human traffic would help it a lot. Here's one of the good things that's going on. These little dark things in between the white poles, that is eelgrass that they're trying to restore to get growing again. So good things are happening there, but people are not happy about some of the projects.
Silver Glen, yeah.
The what now?
What photo is that, of which spring is that?
Silver
Salt.
Glen?
Salt. Sorry, I'm still on salt.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm still on salt. So this is salt. See, this is from that wall facing out. See the little island? And this is that little island from the other direction. So you see the wall there? This is how you come in. Okay, now we're on Silver Glen. Sorry, did I say it wrong?
No.
Okay. So when I was at Salt in December, I didn't have my bathing suit, and there was manatees everywhere, but not in the spring basin itself, because there was nothing for them to eat. Just outside, they had like kind of a line of buoys. So when I went to Silver Glen, I was prepared. I was the only one with a manatee. It was the most amazing experience. One, I've never swam with a manatee before. They're just huge. They're monstrous. And he was peaceful, and he kind of slowly rose up and took a breath. It was an amazing, amazing moment. And the reason I was there was really not to get in the spring, but to see Jody spring from the yearling. And it was raining a little bit, so I didn't get any pictures nearly as good as this. I love this photograph and how it kind of captures that connection that, Jody feels when he falls asleep next to the spring. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. Has everybody been there? I think it's required for this group, right? So I had been to Silver Glen many times as a kid. We would come in from the Lake George, but we could never get to the spring. So this was my first time to go to spring. The reason we couldn't get to the spring is because it was always full of boats. And so this secret and lovely place that Rawlings writes about is again at this crossroads, because they want to try and restore the spring, which means they can't have this all the time. And so, these people feel connected to the place just as well as we do, but to them it is their spring. All this tension. But the interesting thing that I've learned is people have been loving this spring for thousands of years, because we know that this U-shaped amphitheater mound, the site of the largest native gathering site in prehistoric Southeast, was at Silver Glen Springs. So this is the spring run right here, and this is a kind of, I don't know what kind of image that is, showing the archaeological evidence of people using that as a sacred site. There's a great book by Jason O'Donoghue, who's an archaeologist, called Water from Stone, and he writes about archaeology at springs, and he says many springs have been heavily modified in both ancient and modern times, and so we think a spring is pristine, but we know that it's not the way it was before man was there. And so this is, now there's a wall here, and there's kind of a ramp that goes down, but you can see this was a shell mound.
Wow.
And it's also great, there's only one person in the spring, too. One more spring I want to talk about, Juniper Springs. Someone was talking about tonight how Marjorie hated it when the CCC were building there because they were paving all over the spring and making it more accommodating for tourists. This is where I differ from Marjorie. My old Florida has room for the built environment. I really love places like this. I call it parkitecture, or that's a name for it, where they use things like wood and stone to make the architecture kind of blend into the environment more. I'm not a big fan of this thing here that keeps people from jumping off, but I love the old mill. I mean, it's been there since 35 or 36. To me, that's part of it. So right next, everybody's been to Juniper, right? Okay. And Fern Hammock, have you been to Fern Hammock? Oh, it's one of the prettiest places in the state. Again, this wonderful, beautiful wooden bridge. There's a bunch of sand boils there, kind of like Jody Springs. Here's a better photo. It's very difficult to photo because the live oaks go right over the water, so you have the reflection of the water and the deep shadows from the live oaks. I've never been able to get a decent picture. But again, friends of mine who were there just this week said you can't even cross the bridge because everything is rotting there and not being taken care of. So they spent a lot of time restoring the mill, but this obviously needs some help from the Forest Service. Okay, long quote from Marjorie. This is again from Flo's article. Again, showing that Marjorie and I maybe differ a little bit. She hated all the touristy stuff. I imagine that to strangers, even to some extent to tourists, Florida connotes either seacoast playgrounds, orange groves around undistinguished Yankee cities, or vague thoughts on the Everglades and alligators. In the heart of the state, off the highways, along roads hub deep in ball-bearing sand, over pine needle carpeted roads through the pinelands, down mere tracks in the undergrowth through the scrub, where a deer stands blinded by your headlines, skirting lakes in virgin knee-deep in lilies, and no doubt in moccasins, is virgin Florida, still pioneering, still unelectrified, where mules doze under every shed, half-wild razorbacks root through the forest, and the crackers speak good old Anglo-Saxon Shakespearean diction, starkly simple. Joy would never let me get away with a long sentence like that. She'd break it up into like 5 different sentences. But that whole image that she loves, the natural Florida is still being utilized today by Visit Florida on its website. If you see promotions, it's a huge part of the Florida's brand and has been forever. Excuse me. It's from natural wonders to fantastical journeys to imaginations. Visitors to the Sunshine State will discover a long list of things to do in Florida. There's no U.S. state quite like Florida where strawberries go in winter and beaches beckon year-round. And most of these pictures have water in them. But this is the truth of the matter. This is what a lot of our springs look like. And a large part of that is because of agriculture. So remember at the beginning when I showed you all those attempts to lure people into Florida for agriculture? Well, it worked, and it worked too well. These are center pivot irrigation systems, and this thing here is the Swanee River. So water is being withdrawn from the aquifer that would go into springs, and all this is being fertilized and going down into the aquifer. So after my first book came out, I teamed with John Moran and Leslie Gamble. We started something called the Springs Eternal Project. We did a couple exhibits based on our project. And the biggest part of that was using John's incredible inventory of before and after images. He was a former Gainesville Sun photographer and took pictures of springs just because he loved them so much. But when we went back to the very same spots 20 years later, you can see the degradation of their springs. So we took the exhibit and we bound it up in little books and sent it to state legislators. And eventually there was some springs legislation passed and there was a ton of awareness created. But whether the legislation actually did anything is questionable. Another thing we did was try to make people realize their spiritual connection to springs. And, I love that Anne McCutcheon's belief that cosmic connection is a theme throughout Rawlings' writings again and again. And I love the way she writes about that. And so we did billboards like this. This is something I designed where we tried to get people to feel that themselves and equate that to ecology and taking care of the springs. So I think this one was right on I-75. Another thing I've been involved in is the rights of nature. And is everyone familiar with the rights of nature? It's, yay, Leslie is. So our system of laws is based on property rights. So nature gets left out of the whole equation. So basically we're trying to turn that on its head and say, nature has the right to exist and flourish. It's a heavy lift, but there is some progress. The big thing when I do my talks now is I'm a big native plant guy, because that's an area you can do something in your own backyard and see immediate results. You know, take just a little corner or your whole yard, and you know, I struggle with it because I never seem to get the right plants in the right place, which is the key to native plants. And again, I think if Rawlings were still here today, she would be a big native plant person. She loves flowers. So this is Cross Creek a couple of weeks ago. It's interesting to me. I had to go up to Gainesville afterwards, and I was showing another friend of my kayaking trip, and he was terrified of being on the water when you couldn't see a house around. And that was kind of a shock to me, because for me it resets my batteries. You know, it's like recharging. You go out in nature and you feel that sense of connection, and you go back different. And I like to think that's something that Marjorie felt too. So one of my favorite places, I think I stop every time I go to Gainesville, is Orange Lake Overlook. And the Lateral Conservation Trust is responsible for saving this place. Before they bought the property, I used to go by and think, oh, please don't let anyone develop that. Please, it's such a great view. You can see, you know, Orange Lake in the distance at the bottom of the hills. And during Marjorie times, it would have been orange groves. There's still a little citrus packing house at the top of the hill. But to me, this is like, this is the remedy. You know, we were talking about all the growth in Gainesville and all the high rises. This feels good. I feel this in my soul when I go to this place. So we were there 2 weeks ago, and there's blackberries everywhere, and we picked them. And I always feel like when I'm there, maybe Marjorie's with me. So we got blackberries, and my wife made a fruit crumble, and I think Marjorie would have smiled. That's it.